Hey everyone, I'm Dusty, a licensed realtor in sunny Southwest Florida with Schooner Bay Realty. Today, I'll guide buyers through what to expect when receiving a contract that their realtor has completed for them to sign, and also help realtors to fill out the Florida FAR Bar as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. I'll cover key sections focusing on fill-ins and checkboxes, and share tips to help you partner with your agent to complete this important document accurately. Remember, this is a very general guide based on my experience as a realtor and not legal advice. You will definitely need to read through the document to gather the full expanse of what it covers. Let's dive in. Let's start with the basics, the parties and property description sections. Getting the seller's name correct is super important. For real estate agents, the best place to find the seller's name is on the deed, which you can find on the property appraiser's website. Tax records or the MLS might not always be accurate, so always double check the deed to ensure you're using the correct legal name. For buyers, make sure your full legal names as they appear on your driver's licenses are used. If the buyer is an entity, like a trust, corporation, or LLC, use the official name as registered and ensure the person signing the contract has the proper authorization. Verifying these details helps prevent any legal issues later on and ensures a smooth transaction process. Make sure to include the complete property address with street number, name, city, state, zip code, and county. Double check this info for accuracy. Include the property's tax ID or parcel number, which you can find on the property appraiser's website. The legal description of the property is also essential and should be included exactly as it appears on the deed. Don't forget to list fixtures and items that convey with the property, such as appliances or built-in furniture. The contract does list certain items that commonly convey, but still double check that what's written is what you intend to include. Creating an inventory of these items in the additional notes section or as an addendum helps prevent misunderstandings during the final walkthrough. Also, specify any items excluded from the sale. For buyers, remember that your agent should handle all this research to get the details correct so that you don't have to worry about it, but I'm making this video so that you understand what you're signing. In the purchase price section, you or your agent will enter the total offer amount. Next, fill in the initial deposit, also known as the earnest money, which can range anywhere from $100 to over 2% of the purchase price. This part really depends on the circumstance. Specify if this deposit accompanies the offer or will be made within a few days. For example, if your offer is $300,000, the initial deposit might be $3,000. The contract will have checkboxes or spaces to indicate when the deposit will be made. This initial deposit shows the buyer's good faith and commitment to the purchase. Include the escrow agent's name, typically selected by the seller and often found in the MLS listing. Note that clients don't have access to this part of the listing unless given the realtor report. Accurately enter the escrow agent's details, including their name and contact info. Indicate if an additional deposit will be provided later, which shows further commitment. Fill in the loan amount, which is the amount the buyer will borrow to finance the purchase. Finally, calculate the balance to close, which is the purchase price minus any deposits made and the loan amount. This represents the remaining amount the buyer needs to bring to the closing table, excluding closing costs, prepaids, or prorations. The time for acceptance is the deadline by which the seller needs to respond to your offer. Typically, this is set within a few days to keep things moving quickly. Fill in the date and time by which you want a response. The closing date is when the sale will be finalized and ownership will transfer to the buyer. For finance deals, you typically set the closing date about 30 to 45 days from the acceptance date. Ensure the date is realistic for both parties and the lender, considering holidays or special circumstances. Also, note that if this offer is to be countered, that it must be done within 2 days after the offer is delivered. The contract only asks that you supply the closing date, so the other specifics will need to be communicated and agreed upon by all parties. Clear communication with the lender, title company, and all involved parties is essential to ensure everything is ready for closing day. In the possession section, indicate when the buyer will take possession of the property, typically at closing unless otherwise agreed upon. If possession is to occur at a different time, specify the agreed upon date and time. For example, if the seller needs a few extra days to move out, document this clearly and ensure mutual agreement to prevent last-minute surprises. If the property is subject to a lease, check that box and carefully follow all instructions on how to proceed. The assignability section determines whether the buyer can transfer their rights and obligations under the contract to another party. There are typically 3 options. The first option is may not assign. The buyer cannot assign the contract to another party. This is often chosen by sellers who want to ensure they are dealing directly with the buyer they initially agreed to sell to. The second option is may assign but not be released from liability. The buyer can assign the contract to another party, but they remain liable for any obligations under the contract. If the new buyer defaults, the original buyer is still responsible. And then number 3 is may assign and be released from the liability. The buyer can assign the contract to another party and is released from any further liability. This is often used in investment transactions where the buyer may wish to transfer the contract to another investor. Ensure the seller agrees to these terms if the buyer plans to assign the contract. The financing section outlines how the purchase will be funded. Indicate whether the purchase is being made with cash or financing. If it's a cash deal, check the cash box. For most buyers, financing is involved. Check the financing box and then indicate the type of loan, conventional, FHA, VA, or another type. Fill in the financing amount, usually the loan amount expressed as a dollar figure or a percentage of the purchase price. The loan approval period is the time frame in which the buyer needs to secure the loan approval, typically set between 20 to 30 days. Coordinate this with the lender to ensure it's realistic. The loan contingency section specifies conditions under which the buyer can cancel the contract if they are unable to secure financing. Specify the type of financing, such as fixed rate or adjustable rate, based on the loan the buyer is applying for. The contract also provides space for the buyer to set a max rate for which they will finance the home, the term of the loan, and the amount of time after the effective date within which the buyer should apply for financing. Additionally, you can choose other financing options like assumption or seller financing. This section specifies which closing costs, fees, and charges will be paid by the seller and the buyer. For the seller, typical costs include documentary stamp tax, title search charges, municipal lien search, and the seller's attorney fees. The buyer typically pays for taxes and recording fees on notes and mortgages, lender's title policy, and all property-related insurance. There are blank lines available under both the buyer and seller's expected cost sections to list other anticipated costs. Understanding this division helps both parties avoid surprises at closing. Title evidence involves verifying that the seller has a clear title to the property. Specify the number of days the seller has to provide title evidence, typically at least 15 days before closing if there's financing, and 5 days if it's a cash deal. Title insurance protects the buyer and lender from potential title issues not discovered during the initial title search. Specify who will pay for the home warranty plan in the home warranty section. The cost of a home warranty can be covered by either the buyer or the seller, depending on the terms negotiated in the real estate transaction. In many cases, sellers may offer to pay for the home warranty as an incentive to attract buyers, providing peace of mind that major systems and appliances are covered. Buyers may also choose to purchase a home warranty themselves to ensure coverage for potential repairs after moving in. Note that contracts including warranties are maybe not the standard. To complete the special assessments section, follow these guidelines. At closing, the seller is responsible for paying the full amount of any liens imposed by a public body, excluding condominium or HOA, that are certified, confirmed, and ratified before the closing. The seller is also responsible for paying the most recent estimate or assessment for improvements substantially complete as of the effective date but not yet resulting in a lien. The buyer will pay all other assessments. If special assessment can be paid in installments, you need to choose one option. The first option, the seller pays installments due prior to closing and the buyer pays installments due after closing. Installments prepaid or due for the year of closing will be prorated. And then option 2 is the seller pays the full amount before or at the time of closing. If prepayment isn't allowed by the public body, option A will apply for such assessment. Following these steps ensures that all special assessments are clearly addressed, preventing any confusion or disputes later on. The seller's disclosures section requires the seller to attest that they have no known material facts that could affect the property's value or desirability. This includes structural issues, environmental hazards, and legal matters. Full disclosure can be accomplished through an additional seller's disclosure form and protects both the buyer and the seller from future disputes and legal issues. The buyer should verify the property's flood zone and whether flood insurance is needed through an elevation certificate, usually obtained from a surveyor. If the property is in a special flood hazard area or a Coastal Barrier Resources Act area, check if the building's elevation meets the requirements. If not, the buyer can cancel the contract after the effective date and get a refund of the deposit. The contract suggests a default of 20 days if the provided space is left blank. If the seller has an existing survey, it might include this info, but it's always good for the buyer to verify. If the buyer doesn't cancel the contract, they accept the property's current flood zone status. The inspection period is the time frame during which the buyer can inspect the property and negotiate any repairs or cancellations, based on the findings. Typically, this period is set between 7 to 15 days. Set a realistic time frame and ask your realtor for help to schedule inspections as soon as possible to avoid any delays. The additional terms section is where you can include any special conditions or agreements not covered elsewhere in the contract. Be specific and clear to avoid misunderstandings. The default section specifies remedies if the buyer or seller defaults on the contract. If the buyer defaults, the seller may retain the buyer's deposit as liquidated damages. If the seller defaults, the buyer may be entitled to a return of their deposit and potentially seek additional damages. The dispute and resolution section outlines the process for resolving any disputes that arise during the transaction. Typically, this involves mediation as the first step, followed by arbitration if mediation fails. This structured process helps avoid lengthy and costly litigation. The Addenda section includes any additional agreements or attachments that are part of the contract. Clearly title and attach all relevant addenda to the main contract to prevent misunderstandings. Reviewing the addenda with your real estate agent or attorney is crucial to ensure accuracy and completeness. Please note that the contract now includes a clause addressing the sale and purchase of property by foreign buyers. This was necessitated by the recent legislation in Florida that restricts property ownership for individuals and entities from certain foreign countries. The contract requires a signed affidavit from the buyer confirming compliance with these restrictions. And finally, the signature section that confirms both parties agree to the terms of the contract. Both the buyer and seller must sign and date the contract and provide their printed names, addresses, and contact info. Real estate agents involved should also sign and provide their information. Electronic signatures are commonly used and are legally binding. The date on the final signature or set of initials on the document becomes the effect date upon which most contingencies are based. And that's a wrap on filling out the Florida FAR Bar as-is residential contract. Remember, this is a really basic overview and there will always be special exceptions and unique situations. Please make sure to use riders and addenda for any modifications to this contract. Also, remember that buyers and sellers are required to initial the bottom of every page of the contract with the exception of the signature page where they of course sign the document. If you found this video helpful, please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more real estate tips and guidance. Please remember, a lot has been omitted for time, so please read this and all contracts carefully. Thank you for watching and happy house hunting.